Final Fantasy XII is a game that stands out from the rest of the series in a multitude of ways. Initially directed by both Hiroyuki Ito, series battle designer and director of Final Fantasy IX, and Yasumi Matsuno, the director of the spin-off games Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story, his influence leaving a very obvious mark on the project. The game is set in Ivalice first of all, sharing a world with Tactics, albeit set long before. The story style and overall tone definitely place this entry of the series firmly within that universe too. Unfortunately, Matsuno would leave the project partway through development due to prolonged illness, possibly due to the pressure of producing a mainline entry of the series, but more directly due to part of the Final Fantasy XII team leaving to join Hironobu Sakaguchi's new studio called Mistwalker. Apparently, he didn't show up for a month until the crisis was resolved, so it's not entirely surprising that Square saw fit to relieve him of that role, and reassign him to the supervisor instead. I don't think either party is really at fault here. For Matsuno's side, I can see why something like that could break you somewhat, and lead to acting like he did there. While also from Square's perspective, I can also understand why they decided to replace him as director at that point, and if that time frame is accurate, they were pretty lenient really. All of this to say that Final Fantasy XII had a troubled development. While this history does shed some light on certain specific aspects of the game, I think you'd have a tough time realising this playing it for the majority of your experience. I played the Zodiac Age version of Final Fantasy XII on the PC. This is exactly the same as the other modern versions on the Xbox, PS4 and Switch, but with 60 FPS baby. This is essentially a retooled version of the Japanese-only International Zodiac Job System version of the game that was released on PS2 in 2007. This new version is honestly the definitive version of the game. It features a beautifully reorchestrated soundtrack, the ability to assign 2 of the 12 jobs to each character, and a built-in speed mode which features prominently on the control scheme, creating an overall far more enjoyable experience compared to the original release, as well as new game plus and minus options. The job system fully rebalances the game, making it both more replayable and also giving it a bit more depth. The only issue I take with the newest version is that, due to the fact that players could have less than optimal job setups, the difficulty is toned down somewhat. This only really applies to the story fights. A lot of the optional bosses are still formidable opponents, but it does require a lot less effort to beat the story compared to the original version. This is obviously down to taste. Not everyone wants to be overly challenged by the games they play, but it is something to consider. Personally, I'm alright with the truly challenging fights being the optional content, as it rewards those seeking them out with something to sink their teeth into. And also I imagine that the power you attain to practically one-shot the final bosses is also supremely satisfying. Final Fantasy XII came out surprisingly late in the console generation, a full 5 years after the release of Final Fantasy X. As is to be expected then, the graphics are a highlight of the experience. I think the biggest improvement over Final Fantasy X is the facial animations in the cutscenes. They are such a massive improvement, it's unbelievable to me, especially when 10 is much more recognised for this aspect as far as I'm aware. Subtle facial movements are seen throughout and add so much personality to the characters. A small tick of annoyance flashing across the face, squinting over the eyes and a bittersweet smile. It's phenomenal work. As much as Final Fantasy X blew me away with its graphical showcase, it still limited itself somewhat with it being built in a similar fashion to the PS1 games, with pre-rendered backgrounds in places, and a fixed camera angle. Final Fantasy XII's environments are all fully 3D, no pre-rendered backgrounds except for the skyboxes. And it's incredibly impressive. The sense of scale is stellar. Rabanasta feels huge. When you're controlling the camera behind Vaughn, and you try to look up, only to be dwarfed by the sheer size of the buildings around you, not many games nail that feeling. The only modern example I can think of is The Division's New York City, which is one of the few games I truly felt I was in a city of skyscrapers. The architecture of the cities are unlike anything else seen in the series so far too, apparently inspired by Mediterranean countries, with the art team's trip to Turkey at the time inspiring the look of the game. The cities of Final Fantasy XII feel alive, whereas most of the rest of the games in the series would only merely hint at the busyness of their cities, obviously unable to render all of those character models needed. The cities of Ivalice deliver on that front. Previously, most notably in Final Fantasy VIII, the cities would have a few of the normal rendered citizens walking around, while everyone else in the scene was just baked into the background as a static object. Here in Final Fantasy XII though, the streets are alive with citizens wandering around, having conversations or other little animations. Of course it's all trickery, they're not dynamic characters with schedules or something, but the quantity sells the illusion of a busy city better than most other games. Even the shops are well designed, with unique interiors that are incredibly well detailed, with all the clutter found within and merchandise on the shelves. The summons look awesome, the magic spills out sharp particle effects, the cutscene direction is amongst the best in the series, The environments are varied and believable. I have little to moan about with the graphics of this game. I suppose if I were to nitpick, I would say that the first quarter of the game spends a lot of time in deserts, and some aspects of the world are a little low resolution, but those are minor gripes at worst. One of the ways Final Fantasy XII differentiated itself from the rest of the series is through its gameplay. Evolving from the active time battle system the series had become known for over the SNES and PS1 era, we now have the active dimension battle system. Everything in Final Fantasy XII takes place in real time. No random encounters, no separate battle screens. The game even takes place within an open world-like environment, allowing you to look freely around, unlike all the other single-player games. No random encounters means that to start a battle, you select it and run up to fight it from the menu, and the character keeps the attack on their own. It's very fast and fluid, providing a much more streamlined flow to battling and exploring, marrying these two concepts of the game seamlessly. This is an aspect of the gameplay I like a lot, as fighting the monsters never distracted too much from exploring the dungeons, or took me out of being in the environment I was in. It also means that if you want to make a beeline for the exit out of a dungeon, you could do just that without having to manually flee from random encounters. The designers also chose to not include a battle theme for each engagement, which certainly alleviates the tedium of hearing the same song over and over as you fight through a dungeon. That was definitely something that could grate sometimes in Final Fantasy XI. This also allows the dungeon themes time to breathe, which is good, as they're much longer, complex pieces now to contemplate for the lack of a battle theme. The presentation of the gameplay, behind the character with full camera control and patrolling enemies in the world, is often compared to that seen in MMOs. I think there is merit to those comparisons, although the enemy density and placement still feels more considered than MMO mobs generally do. This is still a single player game, so the amount of enemies you find in an area at once feels significantly smaller than in, say, Final Fantasy XI. You can also speed the game up by 2 or 4 times as well, which I highly advise you do to get trivial battles done with quickly. The battles overall are pretty fast-paced affairs, and reacting to everything that can happen could be a bit of a hassle, or at least very tedious due to having to pause the action to navigate the menus. That's where gambits come in. I love this system, to be honest. It's a very simple to use AI programming tool basically. You can set them for each character, and earn more slots to make use of as the game goes on. It uses a simple if-then logic for the actions, and you can set these in a priority order. For example, you can set up a character to have gambits that heal a party member if they drop below 50% HP, cleanse a party member of poison with a spell, and then attack the party leader's target, in that order of priority. This means that you can only worry about issuing commands to a party members if things don't go according to plan, or a situation occurs mid-battle that you hadn't expected, such as a rare status effect. This lets battles flow at full speed, with you only having to make adjustments on the fly as necessary, creating a totally seamless experience when entering battle. Experimenting with this system is incredibly fun to me, and making a great gambit system was a fun puzzle to solve for myself, tinkering away at it after a while in the field to fine-tune it. Now, does this mean the game plays itself? No, not really. Everything about the system is player-driven, and only happens with input from the player. You can't make the characters walk the dungeons for you. Bosses often throw curveballs your way that you couldn't possibly predict beforehand. Of course, there's gambit setups on the internet you can look up to help take on the biggest bosses in the game, but that still requires someone to figure it out and adapt it for certain encounters. You can't prepare for every problem the game can throw your way. For example, I manually chose multi-target healing spells when I knew big party-wide damage was inbound, but there's no specific gambit if clause that fit that particular instance. The gambit system's strength is covering the basics and for tackling specific problems you know will come. This is part of what helps alleviate the battles with the weaker enemies in dungeons, as you can just blow through them with little effort thanks to the gambits. It's a very flexible system, and one I enjoyed engaging with thoroughly. The yang to the gambit system's yin is the license board. You can't do much of anything without the license to do it in Final Fantasy XII. Not even use that fancy new knife you found in a dungeon.
Good evening, sir. I certainly hope you've got a license for that knife.
Well, no, I don't.
No? Then in that case, in the name of the Queen!
Joking aside, I'm not 100% sold on the license motif. Allegedly, it has something to do with the Empire requiring a license to do much of anything under their rule, although that's not an aspect of the world overly elaborated on in the final game. Either way though, I like the system a fair bit all told. It's similar somewhat to the sphere grid found in Final Fantasy X, where you earn license points, or LP, from battles, and use them to fill in spaces on the board. In the Zodiac Age, you choose a job board for each character to start filling in, with each square being themed off those specific jobs. So, for example, a knight's license board will be filled with sword and shield licenses, as well as squares dedicated to heavy armour and extra health. Unlocking the second board opens this up more, as licenses obtained on one board with a character will carry over to the other job's board too, which means that they can complement each other by advancing through the boards quicker. Magic and techniques are bought in stores or found in dungeons, but again you need a license to use them. Filling in the board is really satisfying though, triggering something in my lizard brain that likes to see a sheet of filled in boxes. It's basically the same satisfaction I had with filling in the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X, however it's much more freeform here, and I appreciate that a lot. The major side content in this game comes in the form of hunts. This is where a lot of time can be spent. There's tons of them, and it will take many hours to get through all of them. However, these aren't just simply hunting down a named monster in the world and calling it a day. Each hunt is posted on the boards in pubs throughout Ivalice. However, you still have to talk to the people who posted the bill to initiate the hunt. Each of these has their own little story to go with them, both fleshing out the world somewhat and providing a good chunk of optional story-based content. One hunt will have you hunting a nasty in the desert that an Imperial soldier posted about, as he's genuinely concerned about the safety of the area and paid out of his own pocket to get the thing killed, since his patrol doesn't allow him the opportunity. One hunt has you scouring the sewers for a giant flan enemy that only seems to attack women for some reason, so you have to hunt it with the party only consisting of the female members. As they go on, you fight meaner and meaner monsters that will eventually lead you to the super boss of Final Fantasy XII, Yazmat. This creature is infamous in the community due to its insane HP pool, requiring you to fight it for at least 45 to 50 minutes without fast forwarding the action, but typically an hour or longer. The hunts are a great addition to the game and help make full use of the open world, including sending you off to optional dungeons found throughout Ivalice. The story of Final Fantasy XII is typical Matsuno, little to no romance subplot with a very politically driven narrative. Borrowing the framing device from Final Fantasy Tactics, the game is segmented with passages from the memoirs of a politically important character. This narrative device alone gives Final Fantasy XII a unique tone compared to the rest of the mainline series, providing a grander sense of importance for the events to follow, and setting a rather serious, grounded quality. The animated intro brings you straight in with the focus on royalty and war, important aspects to the story of Final Fantasy XII, and introduces the Star Wars influence in both its soundtracking of the action and some of the framing of the scenes. The prologue chapter tasks you with attempting to stop the assassination of a king who has been lured into signing a false peace treaty. I don't think Final Fantasy XII wastes any time at letting you know what kind of story you're in for. My favourite aspect of this game though is definitely the way the dialogue has been translated. This is 100% some of the best written dialogue I've ever heard in a game. It's consistent, considered, and razor sharp, backed up by a supremely excellent voice cast. The localization team leaned more to theatre actors rather than traditional voice actors for Final Fantasy XII, bring the physicality and grandiose that the script demanded. They also opted to have the people of different nations have different accents, which is an inspired choice in my opinion. They cribbed the rebels are American, Empire is British trope from Star Wars, no doubt, but it works and it works well. I prick up my ears when I hear the diverse accents from the rest of the cast though. Franan of Vieira is Icelandic.
They may hear it, the cry of the Nethicite's power, whispers of the stone's menace.
The Middle Eastern from the people of Bujeba.
So you are the sword he strung above my head. Vane has left not a thing to chance.
Al Cid's incredible Spanish accent.
Al Cid Mar Grace at your service. To think I stand before the Lady Ash, it is truly an honor.
This sells the diversity of Ivalice, and therefore makes it more believable, as it was considered where these people came from, and worked that into the characterization of their voice. All this to say that this is a complete 180 from Final Fantasy X, which was good if heavily flawed with its voice work and writing quality in places. Here, you could be forgiven for not realising this wasn't written in English first. The casting is perfect for the theatrics, creating some truly incredible bad guy monologues.
Hark! Ivalice hails her true dynast king, Vane Solidor. He shall defy the will of the gods and see the reins of history back in the hands of man. His time is nigh! The new Ivalice holds no place for the name Dalmasca. The stain of Wraithwall's blood shall be washed clean from history's weave.
Yeah, I could tell this guy must have been well versed in delivering epic bad guy speeches on the stage. Anyway, back to the actual story. After the intro, we're introduced to our first major characters, Vaan and Penelo. They're orphans living in the capital of Dalmasca, Rabanasta. Vaan is rather naive to the world outside of Rabanasta, but dreams of being a sky pirate to sail the skies free and take revenge on the Empire for invading their home, and more personally, being responsible for the death of his older brother. Penelo is a lifelong friend of Vaughn's, and tries her best to look out for him, and comes across as a much more responsible and even-handed person than Vaughn. They're still kids though, really, and that's reflected with the small interactions throughout the game. They both see through the speech that the newly placed Imperial Consul Vayne Solidor delivers, although are shocked to see so many of the fellow Rabanastre citizens welcome and believe their speech. This probably has to do with the 2 years of being beaten down by the Imperial occupation, lowering general morale to the point that pretty words and empty motions of kindness are welcomed. After seeing this display, Vaughn resolves to sneak into the Rabanastre Palace during the celebratory feast to steal something from the treasury, to take a treasure of Dalmasca back from the Empire. In the palace, he runs into a pair of real sky pirates and thieves, Fran and Balthea. These are an iconic duo, and Balthea especially plays a major role in the story to come. With Vaughn finding a treasure in the vaults of the palace, the three, rather reluctantly at first, make their escape through the sewers. At the same time, the palace is attacked by a resistance army, which the Empire seemed ready for. In the sewers, the party run into a major resistance member being accosted by Imperial soldiers. Naturally, they help out and are introduced to Amalia. Although most anyone who plays the game will know that this is Ash, of Dalmascan royalty, presumed dead after the death of her husband 2 years prior, having been announced as taking her own life. They were eventually caught up with by the Empire and thrown into a dungeon. During their escape, sans Amalia, they run into the last main character of this tale, Bosch, the disgraced knight of Dalmasca, accused of killing the king in the intro and being branded a traitor to the people of Dalmasca. Vaughn shows a great distaste towards him due to believing these lies. Eventually the whole group teams up and aims to stop the Empire in their expansions and lust for greater power. The story is mostly Ash and Balthea's though, with the others taking a bit more of a back seat due to their plot relevance being more front-loaded, especially Vaughn and Penelo. The tale focuses more on gaining the upper hand against the Empire while trying to be politically conscious of their methods, creating alliances with neutral parties, while the Empire goes through troubles of its own. While the tone and focus is rather unusual for a main numbered title, it's still definitely Final Fantasy. The richly detailed and magical aspect of the world, as well as magical crystals playing a large part in the plot. The incredibly written dialogue kept me glued to the screen during basically every cutscene, and it's written smartly enough that upon watching back the story after completing the game, you may notice little subtleties in the way characters speak to each other or about certain subject matters that hint at things to come. It's certainly not a flawlessly told story though. As I mentioned earlier, Matsuno left the project partway through development, and it shows somewhat in the latter half of the game, clearly around the point that Matsuno would have left the directing role. It's not that it becomes terrible, more that the new leads were desperately trying to get to the major plot events that Matsuno would have outlined previously. Most notably is that some of the characters don't fully utilise their emotional potential within the story. There's some setups that don't fully deliver. Part of the reason, I think, is that this is a story much less based on emotional storytelling, and more on intricate plots. It does deliver in this aspect. The ending seems a bit hollow at first, perhaps. However, when you reflect on what transpired, and really think about the goals of the major players, I think the intelligence of this plot is revealed. The major criticism I see lobbed this game's way is towards Vaughn and his place in the story. He's the main character in that we start with his perspective and control him in towns and the like, yet isn't overly important to the majority of the narrative. Sure, it's true he doesn't have a lot to do in the story ultimately, but he does have his moments sprinkled throughout, albeit rather sparingly. However, I think he makes sense as the protagonist of the game. He represents the commoner perspective of Rabanastre. His naivety makes him a good player stand-in for world explanations, and he has the journey of starting with nothing, wanting more, and eventually finding something to fight for. He's not perfect, but still plays a decent enough role as a foil to some of the characters that I wasn't bothered by his presence. The villains of this story are pretty entertaining. I already mentioned and showed earlier one of the judges and their grand speeches. The actual villain of the game, unsurprisingly, is Vayne Solidor. Without spoilers, he's a nasty piece of work. Cunning, merciless, calculated, a dangerous foe. He doesn't interact with the party directly too many times over the course of the game, but we see his actions in scenes set within Empire territory, and hear of his past deeds in hushed tones amongst the judges. He proves with his actions within the game and prior to it that he'll do anything for the power he covets. Learning about him and his various scenes are compelling to see. I'd probably rank him up on the upper half of Final Fantasy villains, certainly more compelling than villains such as Golbez or Exdeath. Despite my issues with it in places, I still think this is a fantastic story. It could have been better in spots. Some characters could have benefited from more scenes, or perhaps more explicit rather than inferred character development. But there's so much good here that I think it overall outweighs the faults. So many scenes I've gone back to watch just for the joy of seeing them again. and with the dialogue being as well written as it is, even noticing further details upon rewatching them. So I'll start discussing some spoilers now. The timestamp should be on the screen now if you want to skip to the music section of the video instead. Alright, let's get to it. Okay, so I mostly want to discuss the ending of the game and also just highlight some of my favourite scenes. Getting to the ending, Ash and the party learn that the Empire has been mostly after Nephesite, used by her ancestor, the Dynast King, to bring a sort of peace to the world through their power. This Nephesite is granted by the gods of the world of Ivalice, known as the Ikuria, and is used to impose their will through the granting of this power. This is revealed to Ash as she gains the ability to attain more Nephesite from what is essentially the source of that power. Just like the Dynast King did all those years ago. The Ikuria have a traitor though, Vanar, who grew tired of using humanity as a puppet and enforcing their will upon them to shape the course of history. So, Vanar revealed itself to Dr. Sid and Vayne in order to help them manufacture Nephesite, and also revealing to them the true power of the relics of the Dynast King. The Ikuria are furious at this meddling by Vanar, and task Ash to take her desire for vengeance and use it to destroy the Empire, to obliterate them all. This hints that the peace that the Dynast King brought to the land to end wars was not due to simply gaining an edge in power, but basically through the threat of absolute destruction. It's suggested throughout the game that the power of Nephesite could be equated to a nuclear bomb in our time. Therefore, the Dynast King of old created a sort of cold war with the other nations, a fabricated peace to appease only the Ikurians. Of course, this leads to Ash unshackling herself from this strong desire for vengeance against all of the Empire, like Varn showed earlier in the story, and uses her gifts against the gods to destroy the source of the Nephesite, the Suncrest. This leads us finally to the ending. Sid activated the Suncrest briefly to feed the giant empirical war machine known as the Sky Fortress Bahamut. The group invade the Bahamut to stop Vayne. He's waiting for the group with a pretty neat speech lined up.
Permit me to ask, who are you? An angel of vengeance? Or perchance a saint of salvation?
I am simply myself. No more and no less. And I want only to be free.
Such a woman is not fit to bear the burden of rule. Weep for Dalmasca, for she is lost. Observe well, Larsa. Watch and mark you. The suffering of one who must rule, yet lacks the power.
Upon his initial defeat, he rides up with the power of manufactured Nephesite and turns into the monster he is. Then when defeated again, Vanar reassures him that even if he is likely to die here, he still succeeded in their mission. Humanity is cut off from the Ikuria, and are therefore free to make their own way through life. Then they fuse and the final boss starts, and it's cool if a little anticlimactic feeling in the moment. There's a brief epilogue that hints at the peace that followed the battle over Dalmasca. What I like about the ending is the layers underneath the surface of it. It reveals Vayne's and Sid's plans and explains why the Empire invaded where they did. It also shows that their goals actually ended up aligning somewhat with Ash, but their methods were beyond flawed, and the collateral damage Vayne created along the way was irreversible. He saw Ash as an enemy not due to ideology alone, but because he knew that she would be the Ikuria's champion to fight against Vanar due to her lineage. What I didn't like, however, was definitely Vayne's hench form. It looks a bit dumb. Like, I get it, it turns him into the monster he always was in his pursuit of power, but hey ho. It's a cool final boss regardless though. Also, there's not too much of an emotional payoff at the end here either, unlike Final Fantasy X or 9. That point I'm more neutral on, honestly. I had a similar feeling on Final Fantasy VI's final cutscene too, to be honest, even if that one included more character moments at the end. One of my favourite characters in the game is one of the judges, Judge Gabranth. He is Bosch's twin brother, and is the one who murdered the king that fateful night in Nebradia 2 years prior. But he's clearly going through some internal struggles throughout the story. His redemption arc as the game goes on is a really interesting one, starting out as completely on board with the Empire's plans, and is convinced that theirs is the right way of things. Over time, as he confronts Ash and her group, as well as being exposed to the scheming of Sid and Vayne, he eventually learns the errors of his ways and aims to protect the younger brother of Vayne, Larsa, at all costs, even if it'll kill him. His fault was not being able to unshackle from the past and see a different future, something Bosch is able to do, putting his trust with Ash for the hope of a new future. Gabranth is the thematic foil to the main cast in that way. Varn, Bosch and Ash are all able to accept the past and come to terms with it, while Gabranth fails to see their reasoning, with him being so caught up in honour and glory from the culture of the Empire. In fact, I like a lot of the cast here. There's barely a dud character. Even Sid, as cartoony as he is at times, has a lot to like about him. A mad scientist who shows no mercy in his experiments, even having an entire nation blown up just to see the power of Nephesite. Even he still gets given a shred of humanity though. Balthier is his son, and even as he passes at the end and dissolves into mist, still delivers a surprisingly touching final line. At least to me anyway.
Was there no other way? Spend your pity elsewhere. If you are so set on running, hadn't you best be off, fool of a pirate?
The collection of cutscenes at the top of the Pharos over Redania are so good. Such a great reward for finishing that dungeon that took me over 2 hours to finish. I suppose Penelo is the only dud of a character, as she provides little to the story and mostly just tags along. I don't find her presence in the party offensive though, just wish she had more to do than be pen pals with Larsa. Other than these two major points I wanted to point out, I think I mostly covered everything I wanted to truly discuss in spoiler time specifically. Play the game if you want to discover more about the story yourself. I think it's worth it. I think the story has aged significantly well what with the popularity of Game of Thrones in recent years, so I feel a lot more people are more open to the more politically heavy storytelling seen here, even if there's a significantly lower amount of blood and boobs in Final Fantasy XII. Alright, I'm done with spoilerinos now. Welcome back to those who skipped ahead. Let's talk about some music. The soundtrack for Final Fantasy XII is pretty much exclusively composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto, whose major previous works include Tactics Ogre, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy Tactics. The style here is very brass heavy compared to Uematsu's work of the series, but it fits the mood of the world of Ivalice, the style being a continuation of the Tactics soundtrack in a way. Highlights for me include Boss Battle, the Dalmasca Estesand, Winds of Change, the Clan Hall, Flash of Steel, the Arcadian Empire, and Sorrow Imperial. I wish I could fit more examples in, but then I'd be showing off most of the soundtrack, which sits at almost 100 tracks. The OST is used in a way that complements the scenes they are used in really well, making the soundtrack more feeling like it's a motion picture OST rather than a game one. Brilliant uses of leitmotif add to this aspect too. So to conclude, in my eyes, Final Fantasy XII is flawed but otherwise brilliant. It contains a story that is complex yet logically consistent, with plenty of nuance within the narrative and some of the richest lore in the series. This is also the best localization of the series, with a voice cast that delivers it confidently. The gameplay may not be for everyone, however I love the combat system, with its focus on abilities and equipment being the driving force to success, while cutting down on some of the fat from previous games like random battles. The lack of random battles definitely helped me enjoy the gameplay more than 10, as that was rotten with random encounters. So where should I put it on my list? Well, I think overall this is a better game than 10. I like the story a lot more, and it holds it to scrutiny a bit more too in my opinion. Vayne is a better written villain, for example. He's a bad guy who's the hero of his story, and it makes sense. Unlike Seymour, who's just a bit, hammy? Seymour is a very fun villain, don't get me wrong, but comparing him to Kuja, Kefka, Sephiroth and Vayne leaves him wanting in my opinion. So 12 is above 10. Do I think it's better than 6 though? That's a tough question. But ultimately, I think I fall on 6's side in that comparison. The characters are also great in 6, and the plot makes great use of them throughout. The final battle of 6 is really epic and built up to superbly. 12 has a fascinating plot though, that's incredibly engaging to experience, with small parts of it I wish were just a little better. So on the screen now is what my list looks like currently then. That top 5 is stacked to bursting with JRPG goodness, and the difference between them all is truly so narrow for me. In fact, I don't think any of the games I've played so far I've actively disliked at all. Will that change next time though with my playing of Final Fantasy 13? I sure hope not. I remember not disliking it that much. Well, hopefully I'll see you next time when I discuss my time with that game. Thanks for watching.